So after you've downloaded the zip, open up the FLAW file. Looks like this. You do need to go through and modify your ActionScript settings, which in 5.5 is over here. Otherwise, it's under File, ActionScript settings in both 5 and 5.5. Choose that. This comes up, and what's going to be off is this path name right here. So you'll click the path there, which will say Macintosh hard drive John, blah, blah, blah. That points to the folder on my computer. So at that point, click on it, hit minus, hit the plus button, then click on folder, and navigate to that folder, that framework packages folder that you've now downloaded and unzipped. Click on it, hit choose, and then you will be up and running. Then, when you go to look at the main property class, or the main document class, currently it was set up, I already changed mine, I'm going to put it back to where it was. It was pulling up game 2. Let's find my other game here, equals a new game 2, which is what we'll look at shortly. And when I test my movie, we'll see it comes up with game 2. It says AI fun, got instructions. If I hit play, I have these 5 things that are now trying to chase me, but they will only come after me if 2 or more are chasing me. Otherwise, if I can sneak up on 1, they will leave me alone. So if I can sneak up on this one over here, only I can get right up to them and nothing. Whoa, but I got too close to 2 and then it fired it off. So we're going to look at that. So what we're doing here is building in some rudimentary AI to allow things to chase. That's what game 2 does. But we'll first start out with game 1. So the first thing after you get your main thing going and you change your ActionScript settings, so after you change and correct the path to your folder, which if you put the folder on your flash drive and change it, then it will work. As long as you just keep going off your flash drive, not on the desktop or anything, then you'll be in good shape and it'll keep running. And you won't have to keep changing that every time you open it on a new computer. Now that we have everything up and running, hopefully all with the correct files, looking at the main file, the only change that I put in here from the previous week is I changed it to game 2, but I want you to first change it to game 1. We're going to make the game 1 file run first. So you change that at line number 20, or I'm not sure, your line numbers may or may not correspond. If you auto format, if you hit auto format in the main AS file, then it should be about line 20. Change game 2 to game, and then scroll down to around line 96 where it says game equals new game 2 and change it back to name equals game equals new game. This is going to allow us to then start out with the single version first, and then we'll move to our fancy version. So when I run it now, it should come up like this. I hit play and there's one bad guy, and if I stay more than 150 pixels away from him, he stops chasing me. When I get within 150 pixels, he knows where I am and will start turning towards me. As long as I keep a clear distance, he won't chase me. So the first thing we're going to look at is how to handle that kind of movement of making the bad guy chase us. Then we will look at adding in multiple enemies and a strategy for making it so that it requires more than one to be close to me before it starts chasing. Now that the single critter's working, so when you hit Command Enter, it comes up, you hit play. He chases you when you get within 150 pixels of him. Otherwise, he stays away. So there's a certain logic, actually I want to show a little bit more in here, a certain logic of this, which is he's going to try and find, in this case, if I move, so I'm coming at him from about a 45, he comes at me at a 45-degree angle. But if you look here, he closes the larger distance first. So notice how he's not really moving up at this point, he's moving across. until he gets closer, then he moves up. And then now he's eating me, and I'm suffering. It's painful. So to open that, okay, so for this I added in as a project. If you don't do that, then you can certainly navigate to the file. The file we're looking for is in the com artboy folder, and you're looking for game. The game file is very similar to what the game file was last week when we left it, except that now there's a player and an enemy. So I have my var for player, my var for enemy, and I create new ones under setup. I add them, and then I add them to random positions on the stage. Well, I guess player's not random. Player goes in the middle of the stage, and the bad guys are randomly positioned on the stage. My amorphous squid, like I don't know what it is, sort of just oddly shaped creature. Now, there's some different things going on here because as I was building the sample, I had grandiose ideas of, oh, I'm going to put in a whole host of different features, and getting the basic AI up and running took more time than I was planning. So there's some things in here that, not necessarily, need, but that's how it is, because it's going to have a move object and then check boundaries and check collisions and all these other things that it's not there, but you could appropriate the logic that we used in previous projects into this, because this framework is a stripped down version of what we did before, unless you decide, unless it's spoon fed to you, it's not going to happen. But that's okay. We'll make it work. So commented lines are plans for things that are going to happen. Notice it says update enemies. I was planning multiple enemies. I decided this first one, game, is going to just be a single enemy attacking me. So it calls update player, which then responds to the keyboard command. So I have my true false because I don't want my movement to be based on key repeat rates. And then player was going to, I was just going to pass information to the player and say, hey, update yourself with this value, and make the player class more of an independent object. But again, in the interest of time, I ran out of that opportunity. So currently I just do a hard update to player. The player changes direction and position based on which key I press. Up points the player up, down points the player down, and moves the player down, changing the Y values plus or minus accordingly, left and right. So the player just moves 5 pixels at a time, and it moves based on which key is being pressed. Could use a switch statement here. And you can clean it up and use whatever kind of iterative logic that makes you happy, or you can just use it as is. Key thing here is when that Boolean is true, it changes X or Y position, and it changes a rotation and sets it hard-coded to a specific value. So this does not move like asteroids where you can move in a circular. There's no rotation of the object of where it's moving on a circle. It just moves to one of 4 cardinal directions. So it's a very simplified kind of motion because I didn't want to introduce that additional math or trigonometry into the situation. Now, if you look at this, my loop function moves objects, and then it calls AI single, because I was going to just take this class and then have the single and the double and triple and all these other things and have it, just all this commented out stuff, and realized the code will be a little bit easier to understand if I just keep it plain, where this class only does single, then I have a separate copy of this class which then allows for additional enemies. So it really doesn't need to be called AI single here, but that's good. So that's artificial intelligence. That's what we're kind of simulating here. So it thinks a little bit when it gains awareness of where the player is. So the real magic in this is under the AI single function. Otherwise, really nothing is new or different that you haven't already done. And I noticed this comment here got a little bit lower than it should have. It was supposed to be up here, because that corresponds to that. So apparently my cursor was on the wrong side of it when I started typing. So what is happening here is I calculate a distance. I'm calculating the distance of the player from the enemy. Now, the equation that I'm using here, and if this looks scary, it should be. You should be terrified. You should be quaking in your pants. You should be fearful of wetting yourself. No, it's not that bad. But if you need to take a restroom break, now is a good time before we go into the math and terrify all of you with its scariness, where all we're talking about is powers and square roots. So the key thing that we're looking at here is using the Pythagorean theorem, which tells us that the hypotenuse of a triangle squared is equal to each leg squared added together. So a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared, with c being the hypotenuse, a and b being the two legs of a right triangle. So line 67, what is the distance between these two items, the player and the enemy, using effectively a version leading up to, it's the Pythagorean theorem, without having to get complex and do the quadratic equation. This works because we have our square root function in Flash. Now, if the value, the difference between the two positions, the absolute difference between my player and my enemy, if that distance is less than 150, I'm turning my enemy towards my player by modifying its rotation using arctangent 2. Now this formula here, you can commit it to memory, or you can do what I did when I was building the example, and I went into my web browser and then I typed in AS3 rotation to mouse, and I started going through some of these different things until I found someone who gave me the formula that I was looking for here. And I tried one and it didn't work, and then I found a separate one because I found, like here, they're using arctangent, but we actually need arctangent 2, otherwise we have to do additional computations. And I honestly do not remember the difference between tangent and arctangent and why I need to know the difference, or arctangent and arctangent 2. I don't remember the difference. All I know is, you know, it does cause a difference. So I think this was one that I found that was so close to working, except that this minus here is supposed to be a multiplier. So I did it, and then it didn't rotate correctly, and I was doing something weird, and then I remembered that when I do a conversion between degrees and radians, which is measuring distance on a circle, that I knew you don't divide by pi and divide by 180. One is multiplied, one is divided, depending on whether it's degrees to radians or radians to degrees. So I knew there was something wrong here. So someone put a tutorial up, very nice tutorial, by the way. So it's showing our A, B, and trying to calculate the angles of rotation, and it's pretty cool. So that apparently his code works, because if we look at the code up here, we can see the eyes are rotating to where the mouse is, as the monster's looking to have a snack. So that's kind of cool. But when he wrote it up in the tutorial, he missed a little spot there, because it didn't work when I tried it as is. So what I've provided to you does work. So I take the difference between the y position, x position, arctangent 2 of that, divide it by pi, times it by 180. That gives me what rotation I want the enemy to be. So the enemy only rotates when my player is within 150 pixels. Again, these are the parts that they're okay, but I'm not. We need to know the distance so we know when we want it to chase. Otherwise, it just starts chasing your player immediately. Because I think it's more fun if it's not always chasing you, but it has, like, you know, something happens that makes it want to start chasing you. Now, what I need to do is I need to calculate whether the difference in my x position or the difference between the y position is greater, because if the difference between the x position is greater, then I want it to start closing the gap on the x-axis first. Otherwise, it needs to close the gap on the y-axis first. So that's what happens here is I have these nested conditionals that says if that distance is going to be on the x-axis first, then it says, well, if the player is to the right of the enemy, then we need to add to the enemy's x position to close that gap. Otherwise, the player, we can assume, is to the left, so then we take away. So it's just nested kind of logic statements to make that happen. I am noticing something here as I'm working with this, which is if you wanted to optimize your code, you may notice it says player x minus enemy x, player x minus enemy x, and player x minus enemy x 3 times within a single function. What that tells me is I probably would be better off than storing that in a temporary variable, so I don't have to write that out 3 times, and same thing with the y. So if you wanted to optimize your code, that would be something you would think about if you're trying to make better looking code. It still works just fine. So figure out the distance. If I'm within 150 pixels, I start rotating the enemy towards my character. And right now it just does a hard rotate to the character. It could be modified so it starts setting this as this is a value it wants to achieve, and then it starts adding or subtracting to its rotation every frame until it gets within that. So it has a slower rotation as it will start arcing itself towards you, and that's actually kind of a very nice visual to pull something like that off. So that's just something else. If you decide to get sporty, you can put that into your project. So once we determine we're close enough and rotate, then we decide, should we move horizontal or vertical? And we compare our horizontal gap versus the vertical gap. And if the horizontal gap is bigger, then we start closing off that. And if the vertical gap is bigger, we start closing that off. And then determine whether we're left or right or up, above or below the thing. And now, knowing that, we can watch it one more time and see as soon as I get within 150, it starts trying to close that gap and then rotating. But we can see it automatically points to the character when it's moving, so it gives the illusion of rotating. But if it had a slower rotation value, so that if I appeared over here and then closed on the top, it wouldn't immediately just snap towards me, but it would slowly start turning in my direction. That could be a cooler visual instead of that hard snap like that. But if I put boundaries so I can't cheat and run off screen, then that could be more fun as well. Switching it over to the multiple baddies is going to require changing the project and main from launching game. So again, right around line 20, change it to game 2, and then scroll down and go find about line 96, change that to game 2, save that. Now if I run it, so it's similar, except now it requires that at least 2 have to be within 150, and then they start chasing. So they're chicken squids. They won't chase me unless there's strength in numbers, and it's an easily modifiable number. So going back to that, if we look at game 2 now and study that, start at the top and work my way down. Scratched out enemy, but I do need a temp enemy object. I need a distance variable, and I need a number of enemies. And then I need 2 arrays that I'm going to work with. One is for storing my enemies, and one is for storing them when they're attacking me. Because I'm going to then keep all the enemies in one array, and then cycle through that and create a second array of whichever ones are close to me. And when that array has 2 or more bad guys in it, then they start chasing. So I'll explain that logic. So I went through a number of different strategies trying to build this example, and some were complex, some failed miserably where they wouldn't chase, some started to grow so convoluted that I realized I was working my way into a bad place. I don't know if this is not really where or kind of how I wanted it to evolve, but it's the way that it did. I wanted to have it process a little bit differently, but to do that I think I would have to then have an enemy class, or a class of an enemies class, much like I have this array for enemies. And then I would need an enemy class, and it would have all kinds of convoluted stuff into it. So I decided to dispense with that. So I went for what is a little more straightforward but not as flexible in the long-term approach with this. Now, looking at it, this concept of having where, unless their neighbor is close enough, they're not going to do anything is what was driving me. So after the interest in starlings and building these game of life simulations and flocking behaviors, we're now back to our enemies here. So I have my game set up that as long as 2 enemies can see me, which means they're within 150 pixels, then they'll start chasing. But if they're by themselves, they don't care. But oh, there we go. We'll get like 3 of them eating me at once. That's kind of fun. All right. So now what's happening here is I can change the number of enemies. So I have my enemies array, much like last term when we put our enemies in an array. I make an array, choose my enemies, then I'm going to loop through and create my enemies. Now when I put those enemies in, I make my new enemy. I'm setting initially, I don't need this line anymore because I added this line later, so I guess that's a relic. So that line isn't actually necessary. But I put the enemies in the array, add the enemy to the stage, put it at a random position, and then I calculate a property for the enemy, dist. It's distance from the player. So I want to know when the enemy is created, what is its distance from the player? I want to have that value associated with that enemy. And now this line I don't need anymore either, because that was a relic from building the sample. So I'm going to verify it still works before I guarantee that. But all right. Yep. So it works. So the enemy needs to have a property of distance. How far is it from the player? This is that same kind of thing we did in the previous one where I calculated a temporary distance. There I just did it every frame because I only had one enemy. Here I initially set it up that value. Then scrolling down, player, nothing changed, but the enemy loop is doing things a little bit differently. So what I have to do is I have to take attacking, which is an array. Attacking is an array. And I have to, as part of that AI, I say attacking, and then I say the array holding my enemies, I'm going to filter it and call this function. That function is here, has these parts that when I call it, because it's attached to enemies and filter, I can now go through and sort my array and return any enemies that their current distance is less than 150. Now, I was able to figure that out by working with filter. We'll go into array first and look in the help file. And so I went to array, then I went to filter, and then I found the sample that came with it here and used that as my guide. Because when I built this sample, I did not know how to use the filter function as part of it, so I had to figure it out. I figured it out by going to the help file, looking in the help file, and then taking what I need. So it says, if I take my array and here and want to filter it based on something, then I call the isManager function in their demo. The isManager function, notice it says element star index int r array, so that looks pretty much exactly like my code. And then it returns any of those. In this case, it wants to know if any of the elements, the items in the array, have a property manager that is true or false. Mine, I want to know any elements where their distance is less than 150. So I'm doing something a little bit different, but I used this. I started with the sample that came there. So I recalculate the element's distance, and then I return anything that is closer than 150. So this is the first time I've used filter on an array, and I'm kind of excited that it worked on my second try. My first paste in it didn't work, so I had to change a few things, and then it worked. Put it in. So at that point, I could have, if someone is in that array, they can attack me. So I'm going to just say greater than or equal to 0 on this. So now they don't need to have friends. As long as they're within 150 pixels, then they will come after me. Like that. But I think it's more fun if more than one has to be within attacking distance before it starts chasing me. Otherwise, as long as someone is attacking me, which then I wouldn't need this conditional if that's how I wanted to do it, because that's, if anything's in attacking, then it will start chasing me. Actually, it should just be a greater than. But I think it's more fun that 2, or we could say 3 or 5, depending on how many enemies are on screen, how I want the gameplay to be. These are all numbers you change. So when that's the case, then we use our temp enemy like we've done on previous projects. And then the rest of the code is the same as the previous example. So this one is just using a second array and then filtering that array, the first array, by a certain criteria, which is that distance element, and then giving me a result. So now I have objects chasing me. And that allows me to make a rudimentary, what appears to be sense of intelligence.